If we will have free and fair elections, then Viktor Orban will lose, certainly. Question is if we're going to have a free and fair elections. And if they don't succeed just with propaganda or nasty campaigning, then it will be a new phase when we will see how far Viktor Orban would go.
This is a conversation with Szabolcs Panyi, a Hungarian investigative journalist. I wanted to talk to Szabolcs because something remarkable has been happening in Hungarian politics. Viktor Orban, the prime minister who has ruled Hungary for almost 2 decades, is now for the first time ever losing by quite a large margin in the polls to a new challenger. The elections are less than a year from now, and it's starting to look more and more likely that Viktor Orban's rule might be coming to an end. And so we discuss why. Who is Orban's new challenger? Why is he able to succeed where so many before failed? And what would his victory mean for Hungary? But also, because this podcast is about geopolitics, what would it mean for Russia, Ukraine, and European politics at large? This podcast is supported by Conductor, a crisis exercise company, as well as by its supporters on Patreon, to whom I'm deeply grateful, and who make the existence of this podcast possible, and who get a bunch of perks, including full ad-free episodes and bonus content in return. And if you want to get more geopolitical analysis to help you filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters, you can sign up to my newsletter, where I break down big picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns. You can find the link in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. All right, so welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me, and sorry for my cat.
No worries. She's very cute. So I was just saying before we started recording that this podcast is usually about geopolitics, but in this case, we're going to be mostly talking about Hungarian politics because I've been following what's going on in Hungary, and I think it's fascinating, and I think it could potentially have pretty big consequences outside of Hungary as well, for European politics, for Ukraine, for Russia. So Hungary, despite being a fairly small country, is once again center of attention. And I've checked, and last time we spoke was in March last year. And I actually checked back then. And back then, Viktor Orban and his party, Fidesz, had at the point very comfortable lead over everyone else in Hungarian politics. And it looked like they were just gonna, if there was an election, they would just dominate it once again. But, and I'm not sure how many of our listeners are aware, but since then, things seem to have changed quite radically. And now the situation in Hungary is very different. So can we start by maybe you describing what has been happening in Hungary and what has changed since the last time we spoke?
Sure, thanks again for having me here and the opportunity to describe this very crazy year in Hungarian politics, or over a year, because this turmoil started back in February 2024. And what happened back then is there was first, it seemed like the minor scandal that erupted. It was about the president of Hungary, Katalin Novák, an Orban loyalist, Orban appointee, very young president in her 40s, quite inexperienced in politics, I would say. It turned out that she issued a pardon in a pedophilia case to a man who was just identified in the media as Endre K, who was basically an accomplice to a convicted pedophile. And this accomplice was trying to help the pedophile cover up multiple abuses of children. The perpetrator was himself the director of an orphanage, and this person, the accomplice who covered up this by trying to pressure, for example, these abused children not to testify, he was the deputy director. And he was issued a pardon by the president of Hungary. And when it was revealed in a legal journal and it was picked up in media, then it became a huge issue, because the president of Hungary, Katalin Novák, portrayed herself as the stalwart of family values. She herself has multiple kids. Previously, she was minister in charge of families. This much praised pro-family policies of Viktor Orban's government was basically handled by her. So this really cut into the core of the government. It it basically showed that this was all just an illusion, and in reality, these people who claim to be protecting the children against LGBT, against the LGBT community, which they try to conflate with pedophiles, for example. So this government itself is basically helping the pedophiles get away with their crimes. And after a week, the president of Hungary resigned. It was extremely likely that she was forced to resign by Prime Minister Viktor Orban to just stop the bleeding, because this scandal really hurt the credibility of the government. And there was also some collateral damage done, because this pardon was not only issued by Katalin Novak, but the Minister of Justice of the government or also had to sign on this pardon. This was a very formal procedure, but Minister of Justice Judith Varga basically also resigned, was forced to resign. And it was under these circumstances that the ex-husband of Judith Varga, named Peter Magyar, who was never an important figure in the government circles, but he was friends with ministers and with influential people. He gave an interview where basically people saw him as a whistleblower or as an insider who turns against the government, who spills the beans on all the corruption and all the hypocrisy. And this has become a very successful interview in terms of viewership. Like more than, I think, 2.5 million people watched it. And Peter Magyar realized that he can also do something with this popularity and with this interest. So he started a political movement, and already in the first weeks, very early polls have shown that there's support for a new face. Hungarians essentially looked at him as someone who broke ranks with Viktor Orban, but also as a person who has this insider knowledge of how Viktor Orban's system works, what's the magic of Viktor Orban. So people started to believe that this guy, who's coming from within the ruling Fidesz party's inner circle, has the knowledge how to dismantle that system. He has the knowledge about all the corrupt deals and all the methods how the government operates, and basically that propelled him on top of the polls. First, at last year's European parliamentary elections, his party scored around 30% of the votes, coming ahead of any other opposition party. And by today, basically, he united all the voters of the other opposition parties behind him. And more than that, also the ruling party's base started to crumble. And currently, all the independent polls show that Peter Magyar and his new movement, which is called the Tisza party. Tisza is also the river in eastern Hungary. Apart from the Danube, this is the second biggest river of the country, but it's an abbreviation for the Party for Respect and Freedom. So this party is polling well ahead of Viktor Orban's Fidesz. One recent poll put Tisza at 51%, as opposed to Viktor Orban's Fidesz party at 35, 36, around something like that. But it's pretty clear that the political landscape has changed. But this is just the surface. So this is what we've seen on in domestic politics. But behind that, there are multiple other stories that really probably tell more than this.
I want to talk about those stories as well. There's a few stories that have to do with Ukraine and Hungarian intelligence, and that one in particular is pretty crazy. But to maybe stay a little bit on this new opposition force, what do they actually, Peter Magyar and his party, what do they actually stand for? What kind of a party is it?
So they joined very early on the European People's Party, and they are basically signing on the moderate center-right values and policies of the European People's Party. But because of the Hungarian domestic political context, which means that in order to defeat Viktor Orban in the polls, any opposition party that wants to win also has to try to attract some of the current voters of Viktor Orban. It also means that that they have to tailor their messages in a different way, in a way that they are not alienating those voters of Viktor Orban who've been listening to his very efficient and pro-Russian propaganda. So what Péter Magyar is trying to do is that although officially he's part of the European People's Party, but when it comes, for example, to the EPP's very vocal support for Ukraine, Péter Magyar is just trying to take one step back and not vote on those issues in the European Parliament or not comment on that. It's a tactical move, not trying to give any comments on the issue that Orban and his propaganda can abuse and portray them as puppets of Ukraine, because currently, after Donald Trump has won the American elections, and then there's a so-called friendly administration in Washington, D.C., Viktor Orban had to stop his anti-American, anti-US propaganda. Previously, myself, my colleagues, Hungarian NGOs, activists, independent media have all been accused of being agents of George Soros, the CIA, the Democratic administration, the US deep state. That's not really working under these new circumstances. So we're being accused of being agents of Ukraine, accepting Ukrainian money and being parts of all kinds of Ukrainian intelligence plots. And this is exactly the same slogans that they are trying to use against Péter Magyar and his Tisza party. And because of that, Péter Magyar is trying to tone down what they are actually saying about Ukraine. At the same time, he's trying to push his own issues and agenda, which is mostly focusing on economic bread and butter issues, because that's what I was hinting at. This is the real story behind Péter Magyar's success and behind the decline of Viktor Orban, is that Hungary is in a recession. Our GDP is not really wanting to grow. There has been a very severe economic mismanagement. Inflation, especially food prices, are really hurting Viktor Orban's popularity. And at the same time, it has just become very obvious that after 15 years of Orban's rule, he just abandoned all kinds of meaningful investments into healthcare or social care or education. And these are the issues that Péter Magyar is trying to highlight. For example, he goes with a thermometer to hospitals to show that the ACs are not working, and it's like 35, 40 degrees Celsius at some wards or at the operation room, which is truly insane. And he's trying to get this message through that this has been a corrupt government, and the governing circles have become insanely rich, while at the same time that money is missing from investments into public infrastructure.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. So would it be fair to say that he's trying to position himself as sort of on the main policies of Ukraine and Hungary's relationship with the EU, that he's positioning himself as sort of the Orban light, without the extremes and without the corruption and all those things?
I think he's seen as someone who's trying to just sit out these debates and not really wanting to be part of it, because support for Ukraine has become basically a domestic political issue, a very divisive issue, not just in Hungary, but also in Slovakia, where the populist pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin governments try to accuse the opposition of treason and siding with Ukraine instead of siding with the national interests of these countries. So I wouldn't make that assumption. We actually see and it's pretty clear that whatever Peter Magyar is saying on these issues is primarily driven by his interest in winning the next elections and also attracting some of the current voters of Viktor Orban. So he's not really saying much about his Ukraine policies. Probably it would be different from Orban. Maybe it would be, as you said, Orban light. What we're seeing currently is just this strategic or tactical intent not to talk about the issue. But honestly, I think that's not a big concern right now, because what we're dealing with currently is Viktor Orban's attacks on press freedom, LGBT rights, and the opposition itself. And I think we'll have time to worry about what the opposition's policy recommendations are regarding Ukraine if and when they are elected to govern.
Isn't it kind of strange and maybe a little hypercritical that Peter Magyar basically spent 20 years working for Viktor Orban and then sort of turned around and started talking about all the corruption, that it would seem like maybe, if he's talking about it and he was part of the system, he was probably somehow involved in that as well.
Yes, of course, that's an accusation that all the other traditional opposition parties are trying to direct at him. Here, I would remind the listeners of Hungarian history, just going back to our democratic transition, regardless of what kind of image the Third Hungarian Republic tried to create. In reality, it was the Hungarian People's Workers' Party's reform wing, so the more moderate, technocratic, pro-Western parts within the communist system, who were spearheading our democratic transition. In 1956, this date is remembered as Hungary's uprising against the Soviet Union and our failed revolution. Well, it was led by the communist prime minister Imre Nagy, who in previous years was ruling the country, and in a critical moment he decided to side with Hungary against the Soviet oppressors. And back in the 19th century, those Hungarian leaders who, in retrospect, are respected the most were the ones who made a compromise with the Habsburg dynasty and with the Austrian Empire. After a failed revolution in 1848-49, instead of fighting against Austria and the Habsburgs, a compromise was reached to create the so-called dualist or dual monarchy. So there is actually a very long tradition that whenever there's a political change in Hungary, it's not some outside forces, it's not the dissidents, it's not the most radical opposition, but actually some elements within the system who are leading that. This is very different than, for example, what we've seen in the Czech Republic or in Poland and in other countries. In Hungary, basically, we always had an elite-driven regime change when parts of the elite defected and led the change. So Peter Magyar actually fits into that pattern, which is a very Hungarian way of of dealing with these things.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I describe a chaotic oil war that's been going on between the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, that you basically never hear about, but that's quietly shaping geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. I want to talk a little bit more about why specifically he's so successful, but I think that before that, maybe it would make sense to try to explain or ask the same question about Orban, because I don't know if how many people are aware, but basically Orban has been in power for almost 2 decades, which is longer than probably any other European leader. And I think it's because he was objectively and is, or maybe not anymore, but for a long time he was objectively incredibly popular. So what do you think the reason for that was that made him so popular for so long and helped him to dominate the elections for so long, despite the quite extreme views, or maybe because of the some of the views that he held?
Well, actually, it's not that hard to understand, especially in retrospect. Viktor Orban was extremely successful as long as, for example, the opposition was very fragmented and lacked credibility. Before Orban came to power in 2010, we had 8 years of a socialist liberal government that had multiple infights, scandals, mismanaged the economy, and the mismanagement of Hungary's economy also was happening in parallel with the big global economic crisis of 2007 2008, and that together resulted in a landslide win for Viktor Orban in 2010, where he acquired a supermajority, a two-third majority in parliament, which then he used to transform the whole system, to push through a one-party new constitution, change the election law, consolidate his power by appointing his loyalists to lead independent institutions, which should have served as checks and balances over the executive power. So there was a top-down revolution or coup by Viktor Orban, who captured Hungary's democracy. And he was popular as long as there was an economic growth, where he redistributed some of that wealth to favor his voting base. One of his most successful measures was the so-called utility price reduction scheme, where instead of letting Hungarians pay market prices for gas and electricity, the Hungarian government was heavily subsidizing those sectors, which meant that people were not really feeling that there was a trouble coming and there's a spike in utility prices. They were artificially sheltered by Viktor Orban's government. But with COVID and with that next economic crisis, the whole system just started to fall apart. The war in Ukraine just happened a few weeks before Hungary's 2022 elections in April. In that shock, just after the war started, people were looking for security, and Viktor Orban used a fear-mongering campaign, essentially signaling to the voters that if you vote for the opposition, if you vote for this quarreling band of unprofessional, inexperienced people, there's a chance that Hungary would be dragged into this war as a neighbor of Ukraine. So he did manage to win that election, but at the same time, the economic foundations of his regime have become quite unstable. Also, after more than a decade of dismantling the rule of law in Hungary, and the European Union, the European Commission, finally found a way how to deal with this issue. This was the so-called rule of law conditionality mechanism that they invented. And as part of that, the EU funds, the cohesion funds, and the recovery funds for Hungary have been blocked. There is still, I think, 19 billion euros that are currently frozen, so Hungary cannot access these funds unless it fulfills certain requirements, reforms of the judiciary, reforms of transparency and anti-corruption legislation, which the Hungarian government is apparently unwilling to do. And this all resulted in a feeling that a big majority of Hungarians now believe that the country is going in a bad direction, that they are worse off than 4 years ago. And again, it's not about corruption. It's not about the rule of law. It's not about human rights. It's about inflation. It's about food prices. It's about gas prices that made people realize that this government is not having anything to offer to them anymore.
It's quite funny how the economy, in the end, the economy always wins the elections. Do you think that it's that the opportunity and conditions were just ripe for anyone to come in and take it? Or is it that Peter Magyar, the new opposition leader, is doing something differently than everyone else who tried it before? Or there's something different about him than from all the other people who tried before him?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, obviously the conditions are currently not favorable anymore for Viktor Orban. I mean, the playing field is still quite uneven because the line between the ruling party and the state is completely blurred. We have essentially a one-party system where all the resources of the state are used to ensure the election victory of the ruling party. This is something that's completely unheard of within the European Union. This is what authoritarian one-party states do, what Turkey does, what Azerbaijan does, but certainly this is something that should not have happened within the European Union. But even with these enormous resources, Orban just seems to be unable to fix the economy. So yeah, you're right. The conditions are currently becoming unfavorable to Orban. At the same time, Hungary's traditional left-wing and even far-right opposition parties had their chances in 2014, 2018, 2022. All of those elections resulted again in a supermajority, a two-third majority for Viktor Orban. The traditional opposition parties were even unable to just slightly lose to Orban. Which also means that people got very tired of these opposition parties. And already back in 2022, so our previous parliamentary elections, instead of choosing a so-called traditional left-wing opposition leader, because we had primaries for the first time on the opposition side, people chose the completely unvetted and unknown right-wing libertarian candidate Péter Márki-Zay, who was and still is a mayor of a small town in a small city in southern Hungary. So even in 2022, people rejected Hungary's opposition and voted for whoever the outsider candidate was at the time. So in that sense, it's not that surprising that now we have Péter Magyar, who's also an outside candidate coming from the inside of the governing camp. It's not surprising that anyone else than the traditional opposition parties and the usual choices for the opposition camp is just more appealing to the voters. But of course, Péter Magyar has shown that he's extremely talented, energetic, and hardworking when it comes to campaigning. It's worth noting that his ex-wife Judith Varga, the previous Minister of Justice, was for a long time seen as a rising star of Fidesz, because her image, her success in social media was really brand new. But it turned out that that was mostly driven by Péter Magyar himself, because he was micromanaging Judith Varga's communications operations. So before Péter Magyar um, started out himself as a front politician, from behind, he was managing the wife's communications and built up her image. So he already knew what works on social media, and a lot of his success is thanks to his very early successful campaigning on Facebook, where he's still much more popular when it comes to reach, interactions, likes, comments than Viktor Orban, which means that there is to some extent a genuine enthusiasm towards him, but also at the same time he knows what kind of messages resonate with the people. What he's not that good at, according to sources who know him or who are inside his party, is basically organizing a party, or he's not paying that much attention to policy issues. At the same time, we're not in a stage of the campaign where policy issues are that important to the voters.
So, one of the things that I imagine maybe also are not helping Viktor Orban is that there seems to have been a steady stream of scandals related to his party and his government. And one of the scandals that I find particularly juicy and that I wanted to talk about was related to Ukraine. And specifically, the way I understand it was that there were Hungarian spies arrested in Western Ukraine for basically asking around what would people think if the Hungarian military entered their territory. And at the same time, there was a leaked audio of a Hungarian Minister of Defense talking about the need for Hungary to prepare for war. And all of that sounds very strange and kind of disturbing if you think about Hungary's past and some of the darker tendencies underneath the surface. So can you maybe explain in more detail what has happened there, and how should people see it, and what should people take away from that? Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.